When you can't stop thinking about a man, it's not love, it's addiction. And your brain is treating him exactly like a drug, keeping you hooked, trapped, and coming back for more, even when every part of you knows something's wrong. Let me challenge something that almost every woman believes about her feelings. Most people think that when you can't get someone out of your head, when thoughts of him take over your day, when you check your phone constantly, hoping he texted, that's proof you found something special. That's how you know it matters. That's what real feelings look like. But here's the truth nobody's talking about. When you can't stop thinking about a man, 3 specific things are happening in your brain and body that have nothing to do with love, connection, or him being right for you. These things copy addiction patterns, create fake intensity, and completely mess up your ability to see what's actually happening. Here's what most people miss. You've been told that strong feelings mean strong connection, that thinking about him all the time means he's the one, that not being able to get him out of your mind is fate or destiny. You've heard that when you know that real love feels all-consuming, that if you're not obsessing over him, maybe he's not right. But that whole way of thinking ignores the basic reality of how your brain actually works when certain relationship situations trigger obsessive thinking. When you can't stop thinking about a man, you're not feeling deep love. You're experiencing a brain response to mixed signals, hot and cold behavior, and needs that aren't being met. And that response creates a mental trap your brain can't escape. This isn't romantic movie stuff or wishful thinking. This is about how your nervous system responds to specific patterns in dating, how your brain chemistry changes when someone becomes mentally stew. Heck, in your head, and the way your thinking gets hijacked when a man creates the perfect conditions for obsession. When you can't stop thinking about a man, your whole system reorganizes around trying to figure him out, predict his behavior, and get the validation he keeps dangling just out of reach. And that reorganization creates feelings, choices, and patterns that have nothing to do with whether he's actually good for you or whether this is actually love. The problem is most relationship advice treats obsessive thinking like it's romantic. You can't stop thinking about him, so it must be meant to be. You're consumed with thoughts of him, so clearly he's special. You're checking your phone every 5 minutes, so obviously this matters. But real love, the kind that's healthy and sustainable and actually works, it operates on a completely different level. When a man becomes someone you can't stop thinking about, when he's the one you replay every conversation with, when he's who you build entire scenarios around in your mind, your brain has locked onto him. And that lock creates effects that most dating advice mistakes for destiny. So stay with me here. Don't click away, because what you're about to learn will completely change how you understand your own feelings and recognize what's actually happening beneath these intense emotions. You'll discover why you can't stop thinking about certain men but not others, why this obsession feels different from genuine connection, and exactly what's happening in your system when he's taken over this much mental space. Let's break it down. Another factor is the comparison trap. When someone takes over your mind this completely, everyone else starts to feel boring in comparison. A woman who's constantly thinking about a particular man will notice that other men who might have interested her before now seem flat. Conversations that would have been fun feel empty. Interactions that might have sparked something feel like nothing. This comparison isn't something you're doing on purpose. It's your brain automatically measuring everything against him. And that comparison makes him occupy even more mental space because he's the clear standout, even if the reason he stands out is because he's messing with your head. Finally, there's the element of emotional investment creating behavior changes. When someone takes over this much mental energy, when they matter this much in your head, it affects your choices and actions. You start making decisions differently. turning down plans in case he reaches out, keeping your schedule flexible in case he wants to see you, organizing your life around the possibility of him. This isn't smart strategy. It's what naturally happens when someone has hijacked your mental space. They start controlling your decision making because your brain has made them the most important thing, even when they haven't earned that place. The first thing that happens to you is this. Your brain mistakes uncertainty for chemistry, and what you're calling connection is actually your nervous system responding to inconsistency. This is one of the most misunderstood patterns in female experience, when you can't stop thinking about a man, when he's genuinely gotten stuck in your head. It's almost never because the relationship is smooth, secure, and consistently good. It's because something about the dynamic is unpredictable, confusing, or withholding. Your brain doesn't obsess over things it understands and has securely. Your brain obsesses over problems it can't solve. Here's why this happens. When a man's behavior is inconsistent, when he's hot one day and cold the next, when he's attentive sometimes and distant other times, your brain goes into problem-solving mode. Inconsistency is threatening to your nervous system because humans need to predict their environment to feel safe. When you can't predict someone's behavior, when you don't know if he's going to be warm or withdrawn, interested or indifferent, your brain starts working overtime trying to find the pattern. And all that mental work feels like intense feelings. This inconsistency shows up as obsessive thinking. You replay conversations trying to figure out what you said that made him pull back. You analyze his texts, looking for hidden meaning. You compare how he acts now to how he acted last week, trying to understand what changed. You think about him constantly because your brain is literally trying to crack the code of his behavior. None of this mental activity means he's special or right for you. It means he's confusing, and your brain hates confusion. The obsession also comes from intermittent reinforcement. This is a psychology term for when rewards come at unpredictable intervals. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. When you don't know when the next win is coming, you keep playing because maybe this time, maybe the next time. When a man is sometimes amazing and sometimes distant, sometimes affectionate and sometimes cold, your brain gets hooked on trying to get back to the good moments. The uncertainty of when you'll get that validation again keeps you mentally locked on him. Another layer to this is mistaking anxiety for attraction. When your nervous system is activated by uncertainty, it creates physical sensations, increased heart rate, butterflies in your stomach, heightened alertness, racing thoughts. These are the exact same sensations that come with attraction and excitement. So your brain feels those sensations and labels them as this must be real feelings, when actually they're stress responses to an unstable situation. You think you can't stop thinking about him because you like him so much. The reality is you can't stop thinking about him because the situation is activating your threat detection system. This confusion between anxiety and chemistry is huge. Think about men you've dated who were consistent, who made their interest clear, who followed through reliably, who created security. Did you obsess over them? Probably not as much. And most women interpret that lack of obsession as lack of chemistry. I liked him, but I wasn't crazy about him. But what if the crazy part isn't actually proof of stronger feelings? What if it's proof of a more unstable dynamic that triggers obsessive thinking? What makes this particularly tricky is that the obsession feels real. The thoughts feel meaningful. The intensity feels like proof. When you're consumed with thoughts of someone, when you can't focus on anything else, when every song reminds you of him and every notification makes your heart jump hoping it's him, that feels like something significant must be happening. But intensity isn't the same as depth. Obsession isn't the same as love. Your nervous system lighting up isn't the same as genuine compatibility. The second thing that happens is this. You start building a fantasy version of him and the relationship in your mind. And that fantasy becomes more real to you than the actual person and actual situation. When you can't stop this enking about a man, your brain doesn't just replay what actually happened. It starts creating stories, imagining scenarios, building a version of him and what you could have together that's based more on possibility than reality. This mental movie becomes what you're actually attached to, not the real person in front of you. This shift is huge because women are naturally wired to be forward-thinking in relationships. Female psychology tends to imagine futures, consider possibilities, plan for what could be. It's part of how women have historically needed to evaluate partners for long-term potential. But when you can't stop thinking about a man, that natural future thinking gets hijacked. Instead of realistically assessing what is, you start living in what could be. And the what could be always looks better, because you're the one writing the script. This shows up in how you think about him when he's not around. You're not thinking about the guy who took 3 days to text back, or who cancelled plans last minute, or who's been unclear about what he wants. You're thinking about the version of him you saw in his best moments. The way he looked at you that one time, the conversation where everything flowed, the night where he seemed fully present. You take those highlight moments and build an entire person out of them in your mind, ignoring all the other data that doesn't fit the story. The fantasy building also shows up in how you imagine future scenarios. You picture him being different than he's actually been. You imagine conflict resolving in ways that haven't happened in reality. You see a future where all the confusion and inconsistency gets explained and everything makes sense. You create narratives where his behavior changes, where he suddenly becomes clear and committed, where the relationship transforms into what you want it to be. None of these imaginings are based on actual evidence. They're based on hope and possibility. What makes this particularly powerful is that your brain can't tell the difference between vividly imagined scenarios and real memories. When you spend hours thinking about conversations you wish you'd had with him, experiences you want to have together, versions of him that match what you need, your brain encodes those imaginings as if they're real. You become attached to a person who largely exists in your head, and that attachment makes it nearly impossible to see the actual person clearly. Another aspect of this is how you start assigning meaning to things that might not have meaning. He did something small, and you build an entire story about what that means for his feelings. He said something vague, and you interpret it as hidden depth or secret emotion. He acted a certain way, and you decide it's evidence of potential you're uniquely positioned to see. Your brain is so committed to the fantasy version that it finds ways to make real behavior support that fantasy, even when the behavior is actually showing you something completely different. The fantasy also affects how you talk about him to others. You tell your friends about the connection you feel, the chemistry you're sure exists, the potential you know is there. But what you're describing isn't the whole picture. You're describing the edited version, the highlights reel, the interpretation that supports what you want to believe. Your friends might give you feedback based on what you're telling them, not knowing that what you're telling them is filtered through the fantasy you've built. What's interesting is women often don't realize they're doing this. The fantasy feels like clear seeing, not like distortion. You think you're recognizing his real self beneath his confusing behavior. You think you're seeing potential that others miss. You think your intuition is telling you something true about the connection. But intuition can't operate clearly when your brain is running on addiction chemistry. What feels like insight is often just your mind finding ways to keep you hooked on the puzzle he represents. The third thing that happens is this: you lose connection with yourself. Your life shrinks around thoughts of him, and you become a smaller version of who you actually are. When you can't stop thinking about a man, your entire sense of self starts getting organized around him. Your mood depends on whether he's reached out. Your confidence depends on whether he's showing interest. Your decisions depend on what might affect things with him. Your identity starts collapsing into this single focus, and everything else that makes you who you are gets pushed to the edges. Women are generally taught to be relationship focused, to prioritize connection, to make space for others in their lives. But when someone triggers obsessive thinking, that natural relationship focus becomes all-consuming. Things that mattered before start mattering less. Hobbies you used to enjoy feel pointless if he's not involved. Time with friends feels like distraction from thinking about him. Work that used to engage you feels like something you're just getting through until you can check your phone again. This loss of self happens gradually, so you often don't notice how much you've shrunk your world around someone who hasn't earned that central position. This self-loss shows up in your decision-making. You stop making plans because what if he wants to see you? You turn down opportunities because what if that's when he reaches out? You avoid commitments because you need to stay available just in case. Your whole life goes on hold, organized around the possibility of him, even though he hasn't given you anything solid to organize your life around. This isn't you being devoted or loving. It's you losing your center because your brain has made him more important than you are to yourself. The self-loss also comes from constant self-monitoring and self-editing based on trying to figure out what will work with him. You second-guess how you come across in texts. You rehearse what you'll say if you see him. You think constantly about whether you're being too much or not enough, too available or too distant, too interested or too cool. All this mental energy that should be going into your own life and growth gets redirected into trying to manage his perception of you. You become a performance instead of a person. Another way this shows up is in emotional instability that's completely unlike your normal baseline. Your mood swings wildly based on interaction with him or lack of it. You feel amazing after a good conversation, then crash when he goes quiet. You feel confident when he's responsive, then spiral into anxiety when his behavior changes. You feel hopeful when things seem positive, then devastated when they feel uncertain again. This emotional roller coaster is exhausting, and it takes over your internal life in a way that leaves no room for the stable, grounded version of yourself. Women also experience this as loss of personal boundaries and standards. Things you said you wouldn't accept, you find yourself accepting from him. Boundaries you normally maintain, you find yourself letting slide. Standards you usually have, I'll find yourself lowering. Your brain is so focused on keeping the connection alive and solving the puzzle he represents that it overrides your own guidelines for how you want to be treated. You become someone you don't recognize, someone who tolerates less than you deserve because the obsessive thinking has taken over your judgment. The self-loss is also about disconnection from your own instincts and knowing. Deep down, you often know when something isn't right. You can feel when someone isn't showing up the way you need. You can sense when a situation isn't serving you. But when you can't stop thinking about someone, that knowing gets buried under the noise of obsessive thoughts. You can't hear your own wisdom because your brain is too busy trying to figure him out, predict him, keep him, or change him. You lose access to the part of you that knows the truth. What makes all of this particularly damaging is that self-loss in women is normalized and even romanticized. Losing yourself in someone is framed as deep love. Not being able to think about anything else is framed as passion. Organizing your whole life around someone is framed as commitment, but healthy love doesn't require you to become less. Real connection doesn't shrink your world. Genuine partnership doesn't disconnect you from yourself. When you see this pattern of losing yourself, of your life shrinking, of becoming smaller and less stable, it's not evidence of something beautiful. It's evidence that something is off. As we bring this together, understand that these three patterns, mistaking anxiety for chemistry, building fantasy over reality, and losing yourself in the obsession, aren't random experiences. They're specific, measurable responses to the reality that your brain has locked onto someone in an addictive pattern. When all three show up together, you're not experiencing deep love or special connection. You're experiencing what happens when someone triggers your brain's addiction pathways through inconsistency, uncertainty, and unmet needs. The power of understanding these patterns is that it lets you see beneath your own feelings. You stop believing that intensity equals importance and start recognizing it might be your nervous system responding to instability. You stop thinking fantasy means potential and start understanding it as your brain protecting the addiction. You stop accepting self-loss as romantic and start seeing it as the cost of staying hooked on someone who isn't actually good for you. This understanding doesn't tell you what to do. It gives you accurate information about what's actually happening so you can make clear choices. Here's what this means moving forward. Stop trusting obsessive thinking as proof of love or connection. Start recognizing that when you can't stop thinking about a man, something in the dynamic is likely triggering addiction patterns, not genuine compatibility. The men who are actually good for you often create calm, not chaos, security, not obsession, clarity, not confusion. The feeling of not being able to stop thinking about someone isn't the goal. It's often a red flag that something about the situation is hooking your brain in unhealthy ways. Understanding these patterns also helps you identify what's real versus what's your brain playing tricks on you. If you're experiencing these three things, if you see the anxiety being mistaken for chemistry, the fantasy building that ignores reality, the self-loss that's shrinking your world, you know you're not in love. You're in an addictive loop. Your brain has gotten hooked on a pattern that isn't serving you. But if you're with someone and you feel calm, secure, clear-minded, still connected to yourself and your life, still able to maintain perspective, that's actually what healthy feelings look like, even if they're less intense. The most effective position you can take is rebuilding connection with yourself while getting honest about what's happening. Don't romanticize obsessive thinking by telling yourself, I can't stop thinking about him because we're meant to be. But also don't ignore the information your brain is giving you. If you can't stop thinking about someone, ask yourself, what